Welcome, everyone. My name is Sofia Gruskin, and on behalf of the Institute on Inequalities and Global Health at USC, it's my great pleasure to welcome you to today's dialogue, Until We Are All Equal, Advancing Equal Partnerships. So if this is the first time you're joining an Institute event, a special welcome. And for those of you who are regulars, I guess I'd say a special welcome back. I did want to say that this year, for those of you who don't know, marks our Institute's 5th anniversary. And we really see it as an important marker. I mean, it's definitely an inflection point to look backwards, but it's also a moment for us to bring colleagues together to actually help us to imagine future directions and priorities. So very exciting. And given our commitments and also, I guess, the craziness of the world these days, this semester we determined to frame all of our 5th anniversary events under the banner Until We Are All Equal. So in September, we launched the series with an event on imagining equal power, where we had a really incredible panel who helped us to think about how to recognize and disrupt power and power structures, with the idea of bringing equity to the forefront of all actions that impact health and well-being. So today's event about advancing equal partnerships builds on that frame, recognizing, of course, that disrupting power imbalances is key, but now with a clear focus on what it actually takes to build and to foster equal partnerships. So this conversation is going to investigate the why of equitable partnerships, including all that becomes possible when people and institutions commit to partnering and to collaborating effectively across disciplines and geographies. But we're also going to talk a lot about the how of building partnerships and what it takes to actually do it in practice, and what's really necessary to move forward away from partnerships that are even inadvertently unequal or extractive. Now, as an institute based in the global north, we take this really seriously. And our responsibility here is to ensure that we, even with the best of intentions, aren't just doing more of the same. And so for this reason, in addition to events like today, and these kinds of opportunities for reflection, I did want to note that along with the Department of Population and Public Health Sciences here at USC, we recently launched principles to guide our own local and global engagement. And they really form the backbone of how we seek to work with all of our partners, no matter where in the world they are. And they're intended not only to provide guidance, but a way for us to hold ourselves accountable for doing the work ethically and as we attend to. And I'm sure we're going to explore many of these themes today, but I wanted to just note this work in case it kind of gives some broader contours to today's event and why it's framed as it is. So on to today's event, moderated by our fabulous IIGH Director of Academic Programs, Taylor Burkholder, who's also faculty in clinical emergency medicine. And he's joined by an incredible group of global health leaders who are long-term friends and colleagues, and if I can say, true visionaries, but all with an immense amount to share about what works and doesn't in terms of ensuring and holding accountable folks for equitable partnerships. So with that, Taylor, let me pass it over to you to introduce our panelists and moderate the event. And thanks very, very much.
Thank you, Sophia, and welcome to all of you joining us from around the world today. We are so grateful to have you here with us for this important conversation. Over the next hour, we'll reflect on what becomes possible when people and institutions commit to partnering and collaborating equitably across disciplines and geographies to enable effective and meaningful global health research, policy, and education. As Sophia said, my name is Taylor Burkholder, and I have the distinct honor of introducing our 4 distinguished panelists who bring a wealth of diverse expertise and perspectives on this topic. Of course, this short introduction just won't do justice to the incredible work they all do, so I invite you to refer to the event description for more detailed biographies on each. Our first panelist is Alice Licati, who is the Director of Research and Community Extension for AmRef International University, and previously acted as the founding Dean of the School of Public Health there as well. She is an epidemiologist and public health expert with more than 20 years of experience leading implementation of research in multiple countries across Africa. She's passionate about education, public health, nutrition, community health, and the impact of climate change on health. Our next panelist is Chris Collins, who is the president and CEO of Friends of the Global Fight Against AIDS, Tuberculosis, and Malaria, where he leads the organization's efforts to engage U.S. decision makers on the life-saving work of the Global Fund and the importance of expanding global health investment. He has extensive experience both defending global AIDS research and program funding and mobilizing civil society as an essential part of the AIDS response. Next, we have Sharmila Matre. She is an independent researcher and consultant with expertise in health and economic justice with over 20 years of experience leading multi-sectorial investments alongside governments, donors, and civil society worldwide. She was previously the acting director of the public health program at the Open Society Foundation and currently serves on the advisory council of Global Health 50/50 in the spirit of advancing equity for a more just and caring world. And finally, we have Sharon Fahn, who is a visiting professor at the University of Gothenburg in Sweden and a professor of the School of Public Health at the University of Witwatersrand, where she has also been the head of the School of Public Health and the acting dean of the Faculty of Health Sciences. She co-leads the Consortium of Advanced Research Training in Africa and is a pioneer in research and public health education in Africa with expertise in research capacity development, gender and rights, women's health, policy development, and many other topics. And with that, I'd like to jump into our first question. You all represent very different kinds of institutions, and with the collective wisdom of this group, one can say that together you have seen it all in the field of global health. A question for each of you. What defines equal partnerships in global health for you? Have you ever witnessed directly or experienced something that stands out as a true example of equal partnership? And in the converse, can you share an unforgettable example of unequal partnership dynamics you have seen and how that affected the partnership? We'll go ahead and start with Alice on this one.
Thank you very much, Taylor, for the opportunity to invite me to speak in this panel. Let me say, as you said, I work for Amref International University, and for us, partnerships are very critical in terms of achieving our strategic goals, but also importantly, global health. So therefore, if I speak about some of them, a good example about an equal partnership. From my a number of years of experience, I've had the opportunity to work in partnerships that were tilted towards one direction, and partnerships that were beneficial, and partnerships that actually disadvantaged us. I looked at a partnership which really advantaged us, whereby it allowed us to be able to, this is a partnership with one of the local universities that we had. The partnership was tilted towards one of those universities. This is because when you look at the memorandum of understanding, it allowed the other partner to lead all the components, and therefore the implementation of the work was done from our end, but the recognition went to one partner. So I can speak about that as an example of a partnership that really did not work well from my experience, because work is done by one partner, but the recognition and the credit goes to another partner. So that is what I want to share for now. Thank you. Back to you.
An excellent point about recognition and credit as well. We'll go ahead and move on to Chris Collins, if you have a moment to consider that question as well.
Yeah, and thank you so much for including me in this great panel. Where I work, I mean, we do advocacy for global health investment, and the partnership is what we absolutely depend on. Partnering with all different kinds of groups, and interesting partnerships where a lot of times the partners don't agree with each other on a lot of the issues, but they come together on the issue of global health investment. And so a lot of partnering for us is making that work, right? Partnering with groups where not everybody sees eye to eye on a whole range of issues, but they agree on this one thing. So how does that work? I think when it works well for us, there's a clear task that everybody can unite around. People are clear what the goal is and what we're working mutually on, and that's a shared goal. I think there needs to be things for all parties involved in a partnership, right? It's not just of benefit to one group, but rather everybody feels like they're getting something out of this partnership, whether it's satisfying a goal they have for their personally or for their organization, or that they're leading it. But I think everybody needs to be seeing their own benefit from partnerships. And then I think, just not assuming that you know what all partners want and need in the partnership. It's about asking, it's about checking in. It's really about making sure everybody gets to participate, and that you raise that question frequently and say, just really try to make sure everyone's voicing what they want out of the partnership and where they want to see it go. A good example and a bad example, really quickly. A good example is I'm involved in a partnership now, which is trying to do civil society-based advocacy around the Lusaka agenda, which is a movement now in global health. And the work of the civil society advocates I'm working with are led by WAKI Health in Kenya, but they bring us all together from all over the world on Zooms, and also share Google documents, which we can edit together. But WAKI Health takes the lead and moves us forward. But make sure that everybody has input and lots of opportunity to get their ideas in. So I see that working really, really well right now. Great model for global advocacy. I will say my example of a partnership that wasn't working very well, I actually wound up with me creating a new phrase, I think, although you can tell me if we already had this phrase in the world. I was working with a group on advocacy around HIV issues in a particular country, and we had a HIV advocate from that country, and we had an economist from the North on the Zoom and in the partnership. And at some point during the conversation, the economist started telling the HIV advocate in the country that she had it wrong on what the key HIV policy and advocacy issues were in her country, and started educating her about what those real issues were. And wonderfully, she turned it around right away and said, "Thank you for your input. Those are not the policy issues for us. These are the policy issues that I mentioned." And then she proceeded to go into detail about her vision. So it all worked out well, but I wound up coining the phrase North-splaining for that event, because it was just so egregious and such a great example of what to avoid.
Wonderful. Thank you for that example of North-splaining. We'll next move on to Sharmila to share her experience.
Thank you. And thank you, Taylor and Sophia, for inviting me to this panel. I think what I'm going to say actually confirms and reaffirms what both Chris and Alice are saying. And I want to reiterate that this question of how do you build an equal partnership in global health in this time when we're deeply divided, I think is really important. So thank you. But I must admit, is there such a thing as an equal partnership in global health? I think partnerships inherently involve differences in power and privilege, whether it's language, location, lived experience, your expertise, or your resources. And like Alice was saying, we come together in a partnership with the shared purpose of advancing global health. But to actually make something, a partnership that's equal, that's inclusive and democratic, requires a lot of work. And there is no one-size-fits-all approach. So what does this work look like? And just based on my experience working and living in Asia and Africa as a researcher with a Southern-led NGO, I think some of the few key principles that I would like to put out there, and it reiterates the example from the examples that both Alice and Chris shared, is that the demand should come from those who will use the evidence. Be honest about why you are partnering. What do you each bring? What will you take away? Set some clear principles around your roles, around communication, around decision-making. So when things go wobbly, which they will, you can recalibrate. And you really need to ensure transparency and mutual accountability. And this can be as simple as sharing budgets, revisiting and sharing agreements, and actually have a mechanism for conflict resolution. I think for me, effective partnerships really actually start with a self-reflection on your own motivations, on your power and your privilege. And from my experience, entering a research partnership with a mindset that you are a facilitator, a connector, a development agent, not as the expert, is really key. And one example is while working as a researcher in Pakistan, we partnered with a local government of Rawalpindi, and this was on a UN-funded project aimed at improving access to health and education services. And I think for me, why this partnership was successful is a good example, is that the evidence was theirs. They collected, they analyzed, they interpreted, and it was with our support. They also secured more funding from the World Bank using that evidence, and this is a tangible result. And there was pride they felt when their community recognized their work. This was their achievement, and to this day, I do maintain relationships with some of these partners. But I think on the other hand, asking what makes an equitable partnership for me raises a larger question, especially after all these years of investment and groundbreaking research. We see persisting global health challenges of gender-based violence, HIV/AIDS, limited access to primary care, and fragmented governance. So I think for me, the question that I'd also want to put out on the table is, and what I've learned from both good and bad examples, is are we in our partnerships involving political actors and really working cross-sectorally? Are we addressing the deeper structural issues? And in our eagerness to secure funding, including myself, are we losing sight of health as a right and a global public good by increasingly relying on public-private partnerships? As evidence shows, this is a slippery slope. So I turn it back to you, Taylor.
Wonderful points, and thank you so much. Last but not least, I'll open this question up to Sharon as well.
Everyone having said something, I think what I will do is start off with the example of have I ever experienced unequal partnerships? And the first thing, and this flows so much from what Shamila said actually, the first thing you'll see is that I'm a white South African. Have I ever experienced unequal partnerships? Are you kidding? Of course. And I've seen them, I've been in them, I've struggled against them. And I think that following on exactly from what Shamila said, is that I think that you have to go into a relationship understanding, a partnership, understanding your own privilege and owning your own privilege. And it's in owning and naming and being able to talk about your privilege that you can then lay bare the ways in which you have to adapt, how you relate, what you take control of, what you don't take control of. And so I think that that's really important. And I think for me, in building more equal partnerships, because I agree, no partnership is equal. Partnerships are partnerships, and they're sharing out of different pieces of the pie, and that's okay. But what you have to be able to do is to go into these relationships aware, and I think particularly of structural inequalities. So these aren't necessarily inequalities that you personally are responsible for. But if you don't go in with that understanding, it's impossible for you to put yourself in someone else's shoes. And those structural inequalities, things like gender, things like race, things like class, things like how much money is invested in your country in the higher education sector and what led to that higher investment. These are the kinds of things you have to be personally aware of. And that's really the introduction I wanted to put here. So thanks, Taylor.
What a fantastic introduction from all four, with incredibly salient points for the remainder of this discussion. In the interest of moving things forward, I will direct this question to Sharmila. So taking a step back, there are so many ways of defining and conceptualizing partnership. You yourself have just mentioned that there might not be such a thing as a truly equal partnership. So considering the range of positions you have held and the work you have done in the donor space in particular, what are the components that you see as key to supporting partnerships to be equal? And what are the obstacles to getting there? And any examples that you can provide that might have been done to address these?
Okay, thanks, Taylor. So putting my donor hat on, in the donor world, there are several types of partnerships. There's partnerships with other funders, the grantee-grantor relationship, And third, just simply supporting equitable partnerships within the initiatives that you fund. And I'm going to focus on this last one. And from my experience as both grant maker and grant seeker, regardless of the type of partnership you're building, again, just to reiterate the point that Sharon has also made, is that the work really starts with yourself and the organization in understanding your power and privilege. And I think that's even more important in the donor space. Now, for some key components, I think, to support partnerships is first, funding should be based on local demand. We need to listen and then together create programs with those impacted by the issue and really, again, avoid a one-size-fits-all approach. As described by Profs. Jean-Pierre Olivier de Sardin, Issa Diarra, West African researchers, donors can act like traveling agents, exposing external models. So what context matters? So the job of donors, I think, is to listen and then deal with their own internal administration and language to support the request they are hearing. The second is trust and transparency. This means providing clarity on budgets and prioritizing flexible and multi-year funding. Next is about inclusive design. Ensure all collaborators, especially those on the front lines, are at the table from the very start. Next and last is support risk and adaptation. Be open to learning, creativity, and even failure. And partnerships cost money, so invest in funds for convening, organizational strengthening, and reporting. Some of the obstacles we do face include local laws, political context, and our internal donor structures. However, there are workarounds. But what donors can do internally is to build diverse teams. Teams with lived and work experience have better appreciation of power dynamics. Next is to really foster an equitable work culture. Practices and discussions around respectful partnerships are essential. And importantly is accountability. Are there metrics in place to assess how you are building equitable partnership? At the Open Society Foundation, for example, the public health program, we used to have a locus of power variable to track whether funds actually reach the communities they were meant to serve. So just to conclude, donors can strengthen the quality of partnerships by really being deliberate in how they fund, in fostering an internal culture that incentivizes equity, and holding themselves accountable for delivering on these goals. Back to you, Taylor.
What a wonderful list of components that you were able to articulate there. And I particularly like your points about making sure that those components are not an afterthought, but they're considered from the very beginning of the relationship that you're building. I'd like to give Chris, Alice, and Sharon each an opportunity to briefly address this as well. Given the very different positions you all hold, are there additional components you see as key, as well as other obstacles you think need to be on the table if we are to truly develop and sustain equal partnerships? We can start with you.
Thank you.
Actually,
Okay.
Sharon, please go ahead.
Okay, thanks. Sorry, Chris. You know, Shmola, I was very interested in the one component you said about having all partners present from the beginning. And I agree with you that in principle, that's really important. But I think I'm wondering to myself, if you've structurally always been the recipient or the researched on or the developed, you know, someone else is developing you, you adopt a particular place in those environments. And your place is often to be quiet, to be reticent, to stand back. And like we did in the feminist movement, or like if you read Steve Biko, or these kinds of approaches has been create the space for the people who disadvantaged in whatever particular way to talk among themselves first, to find their voice, to develop their voice. I've done this twice with varying success. Once on a USAID project where we met before we met with the donors, and I can tell you the donors didn't like that. And the other one was we were developing a consortium which consisted of African partners and then later non-African partners. And the African partners met first and developed the program of work, the concept, let's say, not all the details and not even most of the details. And then afterwards, we invited the non-African partners to join. And for me, that managed to sort of like flip some of that inequality that sits there. So I don't think you can always do it. I think you have to be careful about it, but it did sort of raise, as you said that, I thought, wow, that's an interesting principle, and it doesn't always hold. Thanks, Taylor.
Wonderful. Sharmila, I saw you come off mute. Would you like to respond to that as well?
I think this is great. I think the principle of there's no blueprint is really important. So we can take from the playbook, the feminist playbook, of where you have different groups come together to gain their agency. And I must say, Sharon, I think being half South and half North, the North has taught me how to have voice. And so I totally understand and relate. So thank you for that.
Excellent points. Chris, I'll move to you now.
Yeah, I agree with everything that has been said. So I would just underscore that. I guess one area to just go a little bit deeper is a part of partnerships that I think is absolutely critical in global health now and absolutely in the future too, which is getting it right in terms of civil society participation. That goes for clinical trials, but absolutely goes for allocation and implementation of health resources too. And there's a number of models for doing this. None of them are perfect. The Global Fund, for example, has the country coordinating mechanism, which is supposed to include civil society voices and populations from affected communities. I think we need to really commit, and for me, this maybe is takeaway from this session, is we need to commit to advancing structural approaches to good partnerships and engagement of civil society that can really ensure community voices are heard in allocation of health resources as well as research. And recognize that it has multiple different components. First of all, civil society needs to be in the documents that say what these various decision-making bodies, that they need to include civil society. So there needs to be a policy in place that you can point to and enforce, frankly. And then civil society representatives, need to be selected in a way that's the community that's identifying them. It's not the powers that be that are choosing who gets to sit at the table. Those folks who are involved as civil society representatives need information, the information that everybody else is getting. They need it in advance too, just like everybody else gets it. No last minute information provision. They need, in some cases, support to be able to process all the information they're getting. Maybe something being discussed at an advisory meeting is out of their area of expertise. They need a place where they can go get support for how to work with that. And then they need compensation to be able to have travel expenses and lodging when they attend, but also for their time. Their time is worth as much as anybody else's in the partnership. So we need to be looking at doing much better in terms of compensation for participants. And then you need to review it and assess how well it's going.
Excellent. And Alice, do you want to add anything to this topic as well?
Thank you. I just want to agree with the previous speakers and just to maybe strengthen the point about when you're starting up a sustainable partnership, it's very important to start at a point of trust that the reason for reaching this organization is because there is a value addition they have, and there is trust that we can work together. So for me, that's really important that we recognize the role that they're going to play, and with a lens that they're going to work well. The other point that I really want to strengthen is the area of sharing out the comparative advantage, because it's not always possible to have, as Sharmila said, that to have equal partnership, but it's important to explain or to showcase some of the competitive advantage that you already sit in that is likely to disadvantage or make the other partner feel a bit, maybe I'm too shy to speak about my ideas. So it's good to give and speak out about the comparative advantage that one partner has. And if I look at some of the obstacles that are to sustaining an equal partnership is if we don't reveal some policies within our organizations that may affect the partnership as we move along, that can really be an obstacle, because my experience is we have worked with a partner, then along the line, we are told, oh, you know, our policies don't allow 1, 2, 3, and yet the other partner was a bit more flexible in terms of their policies. So it's very important for each partner to explain or make known policies that may hinder achieving equality, because it's really not possible to achieve equality. If I look at the US laws and the Kenya laws, they are quite different. And those are some of the things that can really injure a partnership that was really meant to work well. Thank you.
Thank you all. Really important considerations, especially with those structural inequities that are influencing even the best intentions around partnership. I'll move along to my next question directed to you, Sharon. You have a long history in building partnerships within South Africa, within the continent, and with institutions in many other parts of the world. And knowing what you do about what it means for partnerships to be unequal, what institutional changes are needed to better build and sustain these equal partnerships? And what concrete steps do you think need to be taken to disrupt the unequal power dynamics across the local, regional, and transnational work we do?
Okay, I'll just fix up the world in my answer. I think that because almost all of us, I work mainly in research, but also in advocacy, and all of this often almost always requires funding. And so funders have an enormous amount of power. And so funders need to understand what they're doing and to be clear and to be able to sort of understand the consequences. So I'll give you I'll follow on from Alice's input around, well, our policies don't allow X or Y. If we take EU funding, for example, EU funding has a formula for recompensing, let's say, researchers and PIs and things like that. And they will say that we will pay the salary of whatever it is you earn at your institution. Now, if you don't understand that for at least a very, very significant, if not all of Africa, African salaries at an academic institution are a joke. They're not a living wage. And if you're going to pitch your policy as whatever you earn at the institution, it's misunderstanding everything there is to know about the international research ecosystem. And so a policy like that actually is very nice, because you've apparently got some benchmark that you can put it against, and what you're worried about is audit trail and honesty and things like that. And I honestly would say that researchers who want to be involved in equal partnerships have to say, if that's the policy, we're putting your time down as double, so that you can get double the amount of money. Now, don't tell anyone I said this, but I really think that if you can't change the institution, you have to subvert it in some way, and you have to subvert it honestly, and you have to be able to argue the case. And quite honestly, it might take twice as long for someone in Africa who does not have access to a library, who does not have internet access, to take twice as long to do something as someone who works in a well-resourced environment where the electricity doesn't go out and where you can go home if there's a thunderstorm. Because the road won't be washed away. So I think that there's something that we've always been scared to do as a community, and that's call out funders, because we're so dependent on them. And maybe that's something we should be thinking about, is how do you actually, as a collective, call out funders rather than leaving it to the most disadvantaged to call them out. I suppose another place when you talk about institutions and we're talking about research are editors of journals. I mean, I know that some journals are very proud of themselves for now in the 21st century, saying, oh, well, if you've got African data, you need an African researcher on your list of authors. And that is a step in the right direction. And yes, I do think that people can be tokenistic about it. And we play into it. And I want to say that we play into it from both sides. So I could be in Africa doing research. Someone says to me, will you co-author this paper? Here it is. It's all done. And I might say, okay, I will, because if I don't, someone else will, and I might as well get it on my CV. So we have to, and also people shouldn't be doing that as researchers. If you've done secondary data analysis of data from all over the world, you can't phone people from all over the world and say, will you be a co-author? So I don't know how editors get that to be meaningful, but I do think we have to think about it and question it. So there's been a lot of research at looking at authorship order, the differential of authorship on papers. They all show that we have a lot of work to do in this area. So I suppose what I've done here is I've said that institutions have to be much clearer about what they decide and what the consequences of those decisions are. I think they have good ideas about why they decide something, but they don't look at the consequences. So I think that could be an interesting place for them to start looking. And then the last point I would like to make is in the way institutions relate to each other. And here I'm focusing on research institutions that are often universities. So besides the differential salaries that people earn, if you're getting an NIH grant and you're from a private university in America, you might get a 60% add-on for your institutional costs. And if you're from the global south, you can get 8%. Now I understand that this is American taxpayers' money. And I understand that maybe you have to be very careful about what and how you use it. But I also think that what you do under these circumstances is you systematically undermine the institutional capacity of, let's say, African universities. On and on, you perpetuate this inequality because you're never making the investments that are required for equal partnership. So these are all hard questions, but I think that they have to be made completely transparent, the consequences of what these kinds of rules are having on the knowledge ecosystem, on the development ecosystem. Don't let me start on trade or aid, but all of these are real drivers of structural inequality, and they are drivers of maintaining inequality. And so I think we have to start naming and trying to work out how to deal with them. That's my contribution, Taylor.
Those are three very wonderful examples, concrete examples that you've been able to name here for us. But I'd like to ask the other three panelists if they have seen other ways to disrupt these power dynamics, even recognizing the inequities inherent in the institutions where we all work.
Well, I would just say, I mean, that was wonderful. I agreed with all of that. You should write that up. I mean, actually, I think as a Northerner, I would say one thing is that, you know, I try to I try to disrupt the meeting when there isn't appropriate representation, when there isn't diverse representation, and I think that is a potentially for us to consider as a role for Northerners to be thinking about in partnerships that involve people globally, is to call out when others aren't being included or aren't being listened to or aren't being asked for input or aren't being supported in being a full participant. I think that can be very powerful. I was at a meeting a couple weeks ago where it was on a global issue, and there were, of 30 people, only 2 were from the global south. And, I did raise it. I should have raised it more vociferously. Next time I'll try to. But I think that's an important role there. The other thing, going to the last comment that I thought was great, is, let's not forget the economics of good partnerships, and it cuts in a variety of ways. Another one, in addition, is just for funders, is the critical importance of providing core support to community organizations. It's, we need to get out of that, I'm going to fund you for one particular deliverable piece, because what we need is vibrant, long-term community organizations. And for that, they need core support. They need ongoing support that they can count on for a couple of years. So that's one more thing to throw in.
Maybe just to add, I want to agree with the two speakers, but where I sit, my role is to grow research in my institution, to ensure that we are able to build capacity for research, and therefore we apply for research grants. I think for me, one of the most thing that I can call it hypocritical is a call is released by NIH and it says it should be led by LMICs. But if you look at the requirements, it's very hard for an LMIC to lead that call. It's just impossible. The horrific requirements are massive. You can't even just, you ask yourself, the time and resources you put a team to do this, and you don't get it. I don't think there is will to really give that funding to LMICs, as the call is indicating. And then there is a line there that, okay, in partnership with another university. But if you look at when now you partner with the other university, it is just better that they lead. So for me, the donors are not actually acting. They speak this way, but I don't think the intention is to build the capacity, because if you really wanted to build the capacity, then you would not put rules around, you should have published, you must be having a Scopus index of this much. Today, I just came out from a meeting where we were looking at publishing, as Sharon spoke about. And we were asking ourselves why African journals are not indexed at Scopus. That is, and we were like so many universities, and very few of them are listed in Scopus. So there is a lot of inequality there that donors must look at it, and we must speak about it. And for me, I think I like this forum and the partnership that we have with the Institute, because we are able to discuss these things. So that's what I can add. Back to you, Taylor.
Thank you so much for that. And I just wanted to give one opportunity, if Sharmila has anything else to add. Perfect. We'll go ahead and move on. It's actually a wonderful segue from your comments, Alice. If I might get your opinion, getting concrete and focusing on research and training, as you've spoken about. First, how do you want students and researchers in training to think about what it takes to build and sustain equal partnerships? Like, what are the key lessons and takeaways from your own experience, and more generally, that you think are important for future global health leaders to be prepared to address?
Thank you, Taylor. And I think for me, from my experience, first of all, what I want students to know, and future researchers, is in global health, partnerships are very important, because diseases have no borders. We need the skills, we need the expertise from across the globe. So partnerships are really important. So we cannot work alone. So that is one point I want my students to remember. Number two is in looking out for partnerships, it's important to have shared goals, shared visions, shared values. because it's very hard to work with a partner which your values or the goals are very different. So if I think about my university that is interested in advancing primary healthcare, in advancing global health, then it's very easy for us to work with a partner that we have shared values. So that we don't just go to a partner because we have been approached. And I think a lot of us, a lot of the universities here in Africa find themselves like somebody has come to you, somebody from the West, and you want to work with because they have asked and they have the advantage. So it's important that you have a shared goal, a shared vision. What do you want to achieve together? The other thing is there must be commitment to nurture the partnership. A partnership, for it to work, it requires nurturing, careful, really discussion, and commitment to review. It's like farming. If you plant a flower, you must be able to water it. You must be able to give it all what it requires. So for me, it is not about signing a memorandum of understanding. A memorandum of understanding is a document that talks about the shared vision. But if there is no commitment to implement it, then it cannot work. The other point is how do we take this forward? Who is going to implement this? Because if a memorandum of understanding is signed, it's signed at this level. So who are the implementers? Because that is where partnerships fail, whereby you speak to a partner and they say, oh, we have a memorandum of understanding, but the implementers don't know. So it cannot work. So we must have a way of cascading it down and having a clear lead and having clear discussions with their partners. The other thing is about evaluating the partnerships and being really honest about it. What do we want to achieve in this partnership? What do we want to achieve in the first year? What do we want to achieve in the second year? What if we have not achieved? Should we continue to have this partnership? What can we change around? So there must be an evaluation that is very honest about it. And then in establishing this partnership, we must put our cards to the table and ask ourselves, what are the strengths each of these partners is bringing on board so that we can catalyze or we can synergize our relationship to achieve these shared goals. So those are some of the points that for me in training and research is very important, that we have partnerships, but without watering it, without commitment, then it's just going to not work. Thank you. Taylor, back to you.
I'm particularly struck by the concept of planning to evaluate the partnership itself and reevaluating the ongoing partnership with some type of structure that is planned. It's a fantastic recommendation for us all. For our other three panelists, briefly, we have a few moments. Are there any examples of times that you might have steered your team or your mentees, your students, away from a specific partnership? And are there any lessons you might share?
Maybe I'll just say that you want, sometimes the best lessons are learned by mistake. And you've got to be there to pick up the pieces, and you've got to be there to be supportive. So you can steer people away from things, or you can suggest what they put into an agreement to make it better. But sometimes, these hard lessons are best learned through failure or through poor partnerships. Yeah. I don't know other people's experience, but that's certainly my perspective.
Thank you. Sharmalasi, you've come off mute.
Thanks. Taylor, I want to pick up something what Alice said. And I think it's the trust issue. I know I've been involved in Aston partnerships where I think if the trust and the values are not similar, you know ahead of time, unless you know the issue that you're working on is really critical and you think you can work through a process where you can work it out. I think if your values aren't aligned, it's very difficult. And unless you put in some sort of clear protocol about it, acknowledging that you're a difference in values. But I'm glad, Alice, you raised that, but the whole issue about values, shared values.
Thank you for highlighting that. It's very important. Chris, I have a question directed towards you, moving our discussion into the ways in which political priorities impact how partnerships are funded and what issues are prioritized. With the US election clearly on the minds of many in our audience, can you talk about the potential impacts of the upcoming US presidential election on global health partnerships and funding?
I can try. You know, we don't know what the impact will be, but it could be profound. I guess, look, I think on a political level in the United States, in terms of funding for global health, I think one thing to say is there is a path to maintaining support in the near term, whatever happens with the election, although it's going to look different depending on what happens. Obviously, we have voting in our White House and both chambers of the legislature and Congress. And so, you know, there's 6 potential scenarios here in terms of which side wins each of those 3, and they will affect how we're able to move forward. I think the other, but I would say that global health in the United States is an absolutely bipartisan issue. It has been for more than 2 decades. And that's really where I work. That's what we try to work with as much as we can. In other words, we try to really assert this partnership between Democrats and Republicans in the United States and say, you don't agree on some things, a lot of things. This is one area, global health, where you have come together to do really great things that you can be proud of. And you can come together now and in the future on them too. So we actually, we really emphasize the history of bipartisan support as a way of nurturing that bipartisan partnership on global health. We have an awards event every 2 years where we give awards on a bipartisan basis to really underscore this. It's actually one of our main themes, is that the 2 parties are working in partnership on this issue. So I think whatever happens with the election, there are Republicans who strongly support the global health portfolio, and there are Democrats. I think that the White House, obviously, who is there, will be critical and really will determine what route we take. You know, in one scenario, advocates work very closely with the administration to get the highest possible numbers in that president's budget request, which will come out in the beginning of the year. In another scenario, we really need to go probably directly to Congress and work with appropriators, both Republican and Democrat, to maintain and hopefully grow global health resources. Importantly, in the United States next year, well, all over the world, is global fund replenishment next year. And so what that means in the United States is we'll be seeking an increase in global fund allocation, and we'll be doing that whoever is in charge. But one thing we've done is to really lay the groundwork as much as we can to reach out to everybody who might be in control in Congress on both sides of the aisle, and get them ready and hopefully in a good place in terms of support for global health for whatever happens. So part of the game, I think, is really just anticipating who might be in control and working with them. The other thing I would say is, which is true in donor countries all over the world, I think, is the strain of isolationism and populism is deeply concerning in terms of ongoing support for global health. And I also think that in the United States, there's a sense among some people on Capitol Hill that they've been giving a lot of money to these programs, for example, PEPFAR and Global Fund, for a long time. And the question is being asked, how long are we expected to give that funding? And I think advocates need to have an answer for that question. We're working on that question. Other groups are. PEPFAR is working on it. Global Fund is. But that's all part of the challenge that's coming our way. And dealing with that isolationism and trying to show people the benefits of donor investment, how it benefits people at home too.
Thank you, Chris. And certainly that bipartisan nature is something to help us maintain some optimism going forward. In our couple remaining minutes left on this panel, I have a brief question for each of you to conclude our program. What is one action or idea you want our audience to take away from this event to move from a conceptual or theoretical discussion about advancing equal partnerships in global health to truly making a difference? You can speak to policymakers, students, academics, advocates, researchers, funders, healthcare workers, or whoever you choose. I'll go ahead and start with Sharon this time.
Thanks, Taylor. I think the thing I would say echoes the point about trust that Shamila and Alice both brought up, and the question about values. And I think the point that other people have made is recognize your own interests, be honest about them, and name them so that you can work out if you share values. I think that would be a really good thing for all of us to do in whatever space we're working. Thanks, Taylor.
Thank you. And Sharmila?
Thanks. First of all, just to the other panelists, I've just taken ferocious notes, and I'm going to subvert honestly. But two ideas to participants on this webinar is, I would say first, reach out to a group that works differently than you, and one that you may not agree with or that's outside the health sector, and have a conversation. Share your approach, listen to theirs, get curious. And you might want to consider introducing them into existing partnerships. The second is revisit an ongoing partnership and build your muscle of courageous conversations to address or surface any underlying issues you may have. Because I think only through honest conversation can we really achieve some of the impact we're aiming for. So thank you for the participants, organizers, and also my co-panelist.
Thank you. And Chris, what one action or idea would you want the audience to take away?
Well, first, I want to say something that maybe just to be difficult, but I actually think, and I started off by saying this, some of our best partnerships are with groups of people who don't share values in a lot of different ways. What they share is one common area, mutually agreed goal, where they know if they're stronger in achieving that goal if they partner with folks, including folks that they don't agree on everything. I've seen it work. I think it is doable. I know it's doable. It's not without its challenges. So, but I think there's all kinds of partnerships in this world. This has been inspiring for me and really made me realize how many different elements there are of nurturing good partnerships. I think there is, I'm not in an academic institution, but boy, today's discussion to me calls out for the usefulness of the structural issues that folks have gotten in terms of making partnerships work. For example, the economic side of it. How do you support partners who may not have the resources that you have? How do you structure in inclusion into decision-making in a way that folks can hold those in charge accountable for that inclusion happening? So I think there's a whole lot of interesting ideas that have been raised here, which would make some interesting writing.
Thanks very much. And Alice?
I think the take home for me is, and as I want to say thank you for the opportunity, is to achieve global health, it's important to have partnerships. So we must always work on building partnerships, work on removing barriers, work on strengthening the partnerships, because we cannot work alone. We cannot achieve the challenges of global health without partnerships, whether it's in research, in training, in whatever we are doing. So for me, that's really an important thing that I want the researchers, the students to take it away. And I want to say thank you for the opportunity to be part of this conversation today. Back to you, Taylor.
Thank you, Alice. As our hour together comes to an end, I'm struck by the strength of the arguments for combating global health power imbalances through equal partnerships and the vision that has been shared to help us all achieve such partnerships in our own work. I want to thank our 4 amazing panelists for sharing their expertise, experience, and wisdom with us today. And finally, I encourage you all to return for the next IIGH virtual event in our 5th anniversary series entitled Until We Are All Equal, Protecting Equal Rights. More details are shown on the screen here. And with that, I want to thank you all for joining us today, and be well.